Hello, everyone. Good day, evening, and night. Nice to see you again. And for fellows who just joined us, my name is Shanshan Zhang, a scientific editor at Oneers, a new flagship journal from Cell Prize publishing high-impact research that seeks to understand and address today's environmental and sustainability great challenges. I will be the moderator for this panel, which is about behavioral change. Over the past 2 days, the conference has touched upon decarbonization pathways towards a net zero 2050 from the aspects of energy, materials, industries, trade and transport, and emission offsetting. While technological advancements and well-designed policies measures are important to the net zero transition, they alone are not enough. Achieving net zero emissions in 2050 cannot happen without the consent and active support of people. Behavioral change by individuals, meaning adjustments in everyday life and reduce wasteful or excessive consumption of resources, is critical to achieving net zero. Just our eating and road transportation have already contributed about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Behavioral changes, however, are often considered to be very challenging, since they are often deeply rooted in our cognition, habits, culture, or even beliefs. But behavioral changes can and do happen. Past experiences show that people's attitudes and habits are not set in stone. Most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated that people are willing to adapt rapidly and sweeping changes to their behavior in the face of a crisis. Have a better understanding of human behavior and the science behind decision-making would therefore be very important to foster behavioral changes by individuals and eventually at a societal level towards a net zero future. That's why we're here today. We're very honored to have an international group of experts join us today. Dr. Leviston, Research Fellow at the Australian National University, Professor Sharon, Senior Fellow at the Center on Governance of the University of Ottawa, Dr. Zhao, Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology and Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at University of British Columbia, and a Canada Research Chair in Behavioral Sustainability, and Professor Prof, the President of the Social and Environmental Research Institute at the United States. And a special thank you to my panelists for staying up quite late to adjust the time zone difference. We will soon begin with Zoe's keynote talk very soon. Zoe's work applies social psychological theory to investigate how individuals, groups, and culture shape people's responses to climate change and other environmental issues. She is especially interested in how group processes and social norms influence people's attitudes and behaviors, and the role of collective action in mainstreaming meaningful climate action. Let's welcome Zoe, and we will soon all mute ourselves and turn off our camera while Zoe is talking. For all the audiences, please feel free to enter questions via the live stream interface. If you would like to ask a question, please do so within the first 90 minutes and ideally indicate which panel member you would like to ask. If we have time, we will put these to the panel members. Well, that's enough from me. The floor is yours. Zoe, welcome.
So thank you, Shanshan. And also thanks to Cell Press for the opportunity to speak today as part of this panel. I'm very excited about that. So today I'll be talking about the role of second order beliefs, which means our beliefs about what other people believe, and also about our perceptions of how other people act. And I'll be discussing how cognitive biases related to those perceptions can help us understand people's responses to climate change and sustainability, and why misperceptions in particular pose some really important psychological and social barriers in transitioning to net zero and beyond. So I'm presenting to you today from Canberra in Australia. It's the middle of the afternoon here, so it's quite pleasant for me. And Canberra is home to the Ngunnawal people, who I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to past, present and emerging. So to start off with, why study beliefs about others? Put simply, because we're humans, and as humans, we're also very social animals. So we often look to other people to guide us in how to feel, how to think, and how to act. And that's particularly likely to happen when we're faced with something new, or when we're uncertain about something, or in cases where the information that we've got to inform our responses is complex. So climate change seems to tick a number of those boxes quite clearly. So exactly who we look to for guidance are known as our social referents. So these referents can be those that we frequently interact with or have close relationships with, like a family member or our close friends. But referents can also be people or even groups of people that we've never met before, but we might hold in high regard. So they might be scientists or activists or even politicians. But on the note of politicians, reference can also be negative. So if we particularly dislike someone or a group of people, then they can actually serve as indicators for how not to think or how not to behave. Another important point is that our perceptions about other people also influence the social expression of our own attitudes and opinions. So we're more likely to express an opinion if we think it's going to meet with social approval, or if we think our opinion enjoys widespread support. So you can see on an additive scale, whether we choose to express our opinion or to self-censure, that has an important influence on what we think the prevailing social norms around us are. The other thing we know is we're actually pretty bad in estimating what other people think and do. And that fact just serves to complicate everything. So other people are important to us in terms of informing our own opinions and actions. But until recently, we didn't know much about how those social processes operate in relation to climate change and the environment. So the approach I like to take when thinking about these social processes is a functional approach. So if misperceptions about other people are partly driven by our internal psychology, if you like, so it's not just a product of some faulty informational cue out there in the environment, then how does this fulfill the needs and goals that are important to the individual? So what social and psychological needs are these perceptions of others serving? So needs and goals might have relevance at the socio-cultural level. For instance, you might want to justify a prevailing economic or a social system and believe that the world is just and fair. Or they might be relevant at an interpersonal level, like we want to feel socially supported and we want to feel like part of a group. Or our perceptions and our own attitudes might fulfill important needs at an intrapersonal level, so internal to the individual. For instance, we like to feel good about ourselves. So just a brief overview, I'm just going to start off looking at some examples of how we misperceive the beliefs and actions of others in the climate change space, then move on to how we misunderstand our own behaviour in relation to others, and visit some of the patterns we see with policy support, including how we misperceive social norms in that policy space. And I'm going to conclude with examples of why our misperceptions have consequences that we need to be aware of as we're transitioning to net zero. I do apologise for any graphs that might be a little hard to read in this presentation, but you don't have to attend too closely to the content of the graphs. I'll be talking through what the takeaway points from each of them are as we go along, so you can effectively ignore them, but they do add colour, I find. Okay, so let's start with second order beliefs. So beliefs about what other people believe. So the reason this became a bit of an area of interest for me goes back to some surveys we ran back when I was at the Commonwealth Scientific, Industrial and Research Organisation, or CSIRO as it's known in Australia. And we were trying to get a handle on people's general attitudes to climate change, as well as their behavioural engagement. So we started with a pretty routine question. That's one of the basic questions we asked our participants. And we did this over several years. And we had roughly 5,000 respondents in each way, so quite large representative surveys, just to get an idea of where people positionally stood in relation to the causes of climate change, because it's always been a little bit of a contested issue in Australia, I regret to say. So this question was, which statement best describes your thoughts about climate change? And our participants were given 4 options. They could choose this red option of, I don't think that climate change is happening. So just climate skepticism, essentially. We had this blue option of, I have no idea whether climate change is happening or not. Or they could select this kind of halfway house grey option of, I think climate change is happening, but I think it's just a natural fluctuation in Earth's temperatures. Or they could select the green option. I think climate change is happening, and I think that humans are largely causing it. So that last kind of opinion type is analogous to the scientific consensus on anthropogenic climate change. So in response to that question, this was the distribution of responses we ended up with. This is what our participants thought. And it was relatively consistent over the years, but I'm pleased to say has shifted recently towards a much larger green slice of that pie. But anyway, here we have the majority of people either agreeing with the scientific consensus that climate change is happening and human-induced, or that it's happening, but maybe it's natural. By contrast, there are very small slices for people who say they don't know, or that it's just not happening. But this was only part of the puzzle we were interested in. So we also wanted to know whether this reality of the distribution of opinions about climate change in Australia was well known to the participants themselves. So what we asked directly after that question was a question that had our participants estimate the proportion of Australians they thought fell into each of those opinion categories. And you can see here there's a general tendency to underestimate the proportion of those who agree with the scientific consensus and to overestimate by quite a margin the amount of Australians who don't think climate change is happening at all. So our participants estimated that roughly a quarter of Australians felt like this, where in reality less than 8% of people were thinking this way at the time. And it didn't matter what the participants' own opinion was. Each of those opinion groups overestimated levels of climate skepticism. So this represents a type of pluralistic ignorance. So by that we mean a case where most people privately reject an opinion. So in this case, the climate change isn't happening, but they assume incorrectly that many others accept it. And that's a problem because it implicates how we interact with one another. And I'll get onto that a little bit later on in the talk. Before we move on though, I want to show you one other thing from that data set because it's quite striking. So if we look at those estimates from this group, the red group, so these are our participants in the survey that answered, I think that climate change is not happening. So for those participants, what do their perceptions of others in the community look like? They look like this. So we can see that this group, the people who don't think that climate change exists, thinks that roughly half of Australians share their opinion. So all groups were inaccurate, but this group was the most highly inaccurate, the red group. So in social psychology, we'd call this a clear false consensus effect. So that's where you tend to assume that your own opinion is the most common one. So let's just stop for a moment on the false consensus effect. So why does it happen? There are competing explanations. So one explanation is that, well, because we tend to hang out with like-minded people, that's usually what we get exposed to in terms of opinions and attitudes. So that's what we base our estimates of the Australian populace on, or the community on, because that opinion is more, what we'd say, cognitively available to us. Another explanation is more internally motivated, and that is that we perceive a false consensus because it's an attempt to unconsciously rally social support, especially in circumstances where we secretly think our opinions might be somehow controversial and met with social disapproval. So you see false consensus effects, for instance, in prejudicial attitudes as well. And I think both those explanations in unison are pretty convincing, and they do provide some clues as to why some what we might call minority opinions are quite difficult to shift. So just a few quick other examples of where we see misperceptions about what others believe in terms of the environment and climate change, this time to do with ethnic identity. And I bring ethnic identity up as only one example of how our social identities and our group memberships are also really important in how we perceive those around us. So some recent work on ethnic identity and environmental perceptions in the US by Adam Pearson and his colleagues looked at environmental concern in different segments of the United States public. And what they found was that Latino, Asian, and Black Americans were actually more concerned about environmental matters than white Americans. But they found that perceptions about who was concerned were very different. So people thought in his survey that white Americans must be the most concerned group, and those other groups the least concerned. And they labelled this the environmental belief paradox. I think the most troubling part of the research was that misperceptions held for Latino, Asian, and Black Americans themselves. So even though this group of people were the most concerned, they incorrectly perceived their group as a whole as the least concerned. And we've run similar studies in Australia and found something similar occurs. So we find that immigrants to Australia as a whole actually have higher levels of environmental concern than those born in Australia. But both immigrants and Australian-born participants underestimate that concern. And Australian-born participants were really uncharitable and also deeply inaccurate on their estimates of how concerned immigrants to Australia were. And that's a problem too. By the way, the environmental beliefs paradox also extends to socioeconomic status. So people from lower socioeconomic status in America are generally more concerned about the environment, but are assumed to care the least. And that assumption holds for both high and low socioeconomic groups. So there's a few examples of misperceptions in terms of second order beliefs, but like how much does it really matter anyway? So even if misperceptions about other attitudes have implications for our own attitude formation, we know there's sometimes a pretty dubious link between people's attitudes and their actual behaviour. So there's the so-called attitude behaviour gap. So misperceiving others' attitudes, maybe it's not so problematic, right? But so let's see how some of these processes might manifest in relation to actual pro-environmental behaviour, so what people actually do. So one of the ways we've asked this in surveys is we ask levels of engagement with a whole range of pro-environmental behaviours. So everything from really common behaviours like turning off light switches, everybody reports that they turn off light switches when possible, down to behaviours that are not so common, like contacting a local member of Parliament about climate change. And what we get if we ask this battery of questions is a nice, neat, normally distributed curve whereby there's lots of people doing a moderate amount of those behaviours, and less commonly, you've got some people doing hardly anything and a handful of people saying they're doing everything. Now, much as we did for opinions about climate change, we've also asked people to estimate their pro-environmental behavioural performance and compare it to other Australians. And this is what we get. Maybe unsurprisingly, most people say they do about the same as other Australians, but it's in the two tails where we pick up the difference. So we can see that more than 40% think they're doing a bit more or much more than average, but only 6% confess they might not be up to scratch. Now, some of these people who say they're doing much more, they might be right, but they can't all be right because we've got a nice representative sample of people with a nice normal distribution of behavioural engagement. So what happens if we cross-reference people's actual behaviour with their estimates of how well they're doing compared to everybody else? So when we cross-reference those behaviours with their estimates, we can actually see that quite a few people were accurate. So they were comparatively bad and they knew it, or they were comparatively the same or better than other people, and they knew it. But we can see here that the majority of the sample could be termed self-enhancers. So they overestimated how good their actual behaviour was relative to other people. So that tendency to overestimate our own performance when we're comparing ourselves to others, a classic example of the better than average effect, or which is the tendency to think we're better than average, and that occurs on a whole range of factors. My favourite one being that we tend to think that we're less biased than other people. It occurs over multiple domains. There's a classic study in Sweden, replicated in the United States, that roughly 90% of people think they're better than average driver. And this is what we find, albeit perhaps to a lesser extent, in terms of pro-environmental behaviour. Why do we have the tendency? In simple terms, it makes us feel good to think that we might be a little bit better than others. But of course, not everyone's prone to the bias. And we could see on the previous slide, a fair proportion of our participants don't actually give themselves the credit they deserve. But for people who do overestimate their behaviour in relations to others, it has important consequences too, which again we'll return to in a minute. So in addition to what individuals are doing to combat climate change, of course, another outcome variable, another outcome that's of interest to us is the level of support among people who vote for various policy initiatives to mitigate or adapt to the effects of climate change. So again, we can ask people about, don't worry about the detail of that slide too much because it's probably too hard to decipher, but we can ask people about a suite of potential policies to assess their support for it. So including things like, it might be introducing a tax on carbon emitting industries, it might be banning coal subsidies, could be augmenting water supplies with treated sewage. And when we ask a representative sample about their support for these policies, we can see that overall, with a few exceptions, they garner support on average, and many policies are quite strongly supported. Again, if we ask people to estimate how much others in the community would accept it, and that's indicated by the inclusion of the grey bars there, you can see that in nearly all cases, people underestimate how popular these policies are. So we have another mild pluralistic ignorance effect here again. Now, we also looked at how these estimates of others' policy support differed by voting groups. So without going into major detail and the ins and outs of Australian politics, I'll simply say that Australia is in an unfortunate position of being quite split along partisan lines when it comes to attitudes about climate change. So how threatening people find it, how severe they think the problem is, and so on. So we split respondents up based on who they intended to vote for. And we actually found there was surprisingly little difference in support for those policies overall as a function of voting. So this partisan split we find in terms of climate attitudes seems much less pronounced when it comes to initiatives to address it. But when it comes to perceptions of others, again, it's a different story. So we also asked these partisans to estimate support from each of the different voting groups. And our participants perceived much more polarisation based on partisanship than there actually was. And people who voted for the Greens Party in particular, so this is the environmental party in Australia, had extremely polarised views of others. So in short, they thought that they, along with maybe some moderate left-wing voters, were really the only people who supported these policies, when in fact that wasn't the case. So there's the summary of some of the perceptions and misperceptions we tend to have about other people when it comes to climate change, sustainability, and the environment. So now at the start, I mentioned that these perceptions are important because to some extent they can shape and influence our own thoughts and behaviours on matters. So let's go through a few ways in which these perceptions might have consequences we need to be aware of and, if possible, overcome as we're striving for net zero. So going back to that first finding, that all groups, independent of their opinion about climate change, overestimate how common climate skepticism is, our pluralistic ignorance finding. So there was some follow-up work on these findings that was conducted by Nathaniel Geiger and Jeannotte Swim in the United States. And they showed that experimentally manipulating levels of apparent climate skepticism in the eyes of those who believe in climate change led those people to self-censure their views in a subsequent social setting. So that is, if people who held attitudes on climate change that matched the scientific consensus were led to believe that climate skeptics were more numerous than in reality, they were less willing to share their concerns about climate change publicly. So writ large, you could see how this could serve to reinforce misperceptions of opinion. So if nobody talks about climate change, then that kind of sends a signal to us that nobody cares. And in turn, that makes us even less willing to express our own concerns. So that's what Elizabeth Noll-Newman refers to as spirals of silence. Then our second finding, that people who didn't think the climate was changing grossly overestimated the social support in the community for their own view. So we found when we followed up with our participants a year later, that those with the highest false consensus levels were the most likely, or the least likely, sorry, to change their initial opinion. So that suggests that false consensus is associated with a more kind of entrenched view, and that these people will be difficult to shift attitudinally. And I think it begs the question to social scientists and others of how much effort are we willing to put into a small minority of people who are simply going to refuse to budge? A counter question might be, wouldn't our efforts be better invested in people who don't have to be persuaded that climate change is a threat? They believe the science, but they've got a whole bunch of other faulty assumptions instead. And I tend to favour that latter question after many years of not thinking about it. So we saw that one of those faulty assumptions was about ethnic and socio-economic groups. So now on the issue of ethnic and cultural identity and diversity more broadly, climate and environmental movements in general have a bit of a problem in countries like Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. So I want to be clear, I'm coming from a distinct cultural perspective here that might not translate elsewhere. Each place has its own dynamics that need to be appreciated. So these dynamics will make things play out differently in different parts of the world. But in this case, the problem is a self-confessed one by these movements, but it's too white and it's too privileged. And a lack of diversity is, well, firstly, it's important in terms of strategy. So, for instance, if you're using commuter disruption as a protest tactic, then you need to be aware that's going to differentially affect some sections of the community more than others and put people offside. And it's a problem in terms of optics too, because the optics of protests, a lot of which get a lot of media attention, are another way of implicitly signalling social normative information. So if you're a passive consumer of the news and you're watching this protest, you might ask, who are the people marching in the streets? Are they people like me? And if you don't see people from your background, it does send an implicit signal that your group, well, maybe they don't care quite as much, which can lead to a stereotyping of certain groups not caring and even internalization of that stereotype. The old adage, you can't be what you can't see, might be relevant here, I think. And social movements, if that kind of diversity, lack of diversity becomes baked in, then that's a real problem in how effective they're going to be moving forward. Third, we have the better than average effect. So in that same study, we looked at our three groups: the accurate people who were accurate about their behaviour, the self-deprecators and the self-enhancers, to see how those people differed in other responses to climate change. And what we found is those self-enhancers perceived less personal harm from climate change, they felt less guilty about it, and they felt lower levels of ethical and moral duty to respond to climate change. And those associations held even if we just looked at people who accept the scientific consensus on climate change. So this hints at kind of the various functions and consequences of misperceiving behavioural norms, for instance, guilt reduction. It's essentially a process of saying, well, I'm already doing my bit, so I don't feel, I'm therefore unmotivated to to do more. The better than average effect also poses a particular challenge for those who want to promote better environmental behaviour or more environmental behaviour in poor performance. Because if you're constructing those communication campaigns aimed at people who could do better, those poor performers might have no idea that you're talking to them, because they're like, yeah, but I'm great. Yes, other people should be doing more. So it becomes difficult to get cut through with those sort of campaigns. And finally, misperceiving support in the policy space is also consequential, because you don't have to personally support a policy to see it as legitimate. So if you think something has widespread support from the voting public, even if you disagree with it, you'll be less likely to contest it. And the reverse is also true. If you actively support a policy, you might be less willing to agitate for it if you believe, well, nobody else wants it. And with regard to our false policy support polarisation along those political lines, then that too can potentially hamper this kind of constructive cross-party discussions about policy that's already agreed on across the electorate as a good thing to do. And it might even hamper you having a discussion in a social setting with somebody else because you know what their political ideology is and just make a false assumption that, well, they're not going to care about this policy, so I'm not going to even discuss it. So we need to guard against that. And so just by way of concluding, I would like to acknowledge that the majority of what I've presented here today that definitely concerns the individual. But these cognitive biases are not limited to general publics or passive consumers, but they also extend to those working in various change agencies and at political and governance levels too, because, you know, and to scientists and social scientists as well. We all have many hats to wear as individuals, and we can bring this cognitive baggage with us as well. For instance, there's research from Kelly Fielding and her colleagues at University of Queensland that most elected officials believe their own climate attitudes were more pro-climate than their constituents. And we could also expect that pluralistic ignorance with regard to policy support extends to policymakers too. So whereby the appetite for even quite radical shifts in systems and technologies, the appetite is there, but assumed incorrectly by policymakers that, you know, the public's just not ready for it, they've yet to be convinced on the scientific and social grounds, etc. And of course, it's not just an individual's attitudes and values that will determine how they respond to initiatives that get us to net zero, but also the cultural context in which those initiatives are situated, and also the characteristics of those initiatives and how they're packaged up. So with that in mind, I'm really excited to hear from the rest of our panelists and looking forward to the group discussion after that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for this excellent keynote talk, and thank you for walking us through from second-order belief to misconsumption and to misperception, and to pro-environmental behavior, and then touch upon more broadly about government and initiatives impacts. I think it sets a really nice context for our panel discussion, and I'm really looking forward to that. But before that, I think we will first have some welcome our panelists to give also their individual presentations, and you each will have about 10 minutes to introduce yourself and your research interest in the context of this panel. And maybe we will start from Professor Sharon Jeannotte from the University of Ottawa. Welcome on board, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shanshan. First of all, I want to greet all the conference participants. I am a senior fellow with the Center on Governance at the University of Ottawa. My specialty is cultural policy, and I am also an Indigenous person. So that is my background. This is where I am coming from. I am also coming to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. That is where the city of Ottawa, the capital of Canada, is located. I think it's appropriate that I begin this presentation with a recognition of the peoples who have lived on this territory before colonization and who continue to live here, acting as the protectors of the land which they have occupied for millennia. I'm going to share my screen with you now, which I should have done at the beginning.
Not a problem at all. Take your time. Yes, yes, we can see it.
Can you see it?
Yes, perfectly.
Good, because I can't.
Oh,
Oh, here we go. I'm honored to be part of this panel on societal transformation toward a net zero future for the planet. My fellow panelists will be focusing on behavioral changes that will be required within our social systems to effect this transformation. My contribution to this panel is a little different. I'm here to discuss culture, which underpins all societies and which influences this behavior. And I must say, often makes it very difficult to change. In the English language, there are over 160 definitions of culture. So that you understand how I am using the word, I've adopted the definition used by the United Nations Cultural, Scientific, and Educational Organization, UNESCO, which states that culture should be regarded as a set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features of society or a social group, and that it encompasses, in addition to art and literature, lifestyles, ways of living together, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. When I use the word culture in the following presentation, this is what I mean, although I will be mainly focusing on value systems because I only have 10 minutes. I should also clarify that what I will be focusing on in my presentation are the foundations of Western cultures. I'm not an expert in Eastern cultures, and I'm sure the foundations differ considerably. My intention here is to show how deep-seated values embedded in Western cultures act as barriers to the transition to a net zero future. I'm going to start with what I consider one of the foundations of Western culture, which is the great chain of being. Now, the great chain of being was a concept first expressed by the Greek philosophers Plato, Aristotle, and their followers. It was later adopted by the Christian Church in the Middle Ages as a foundational principle governing the structure of all matter and life. As you'll see on this chain, which is hierarchical, God is at the highest station because God is perfect and is outside of all time and space. Big old God were the angelic beings who were the pure spirits. Below the angels were humanity who shared some spiritual qualities with God and the angels, but also possessed physical bodies and needs. Below humanity were the animals, which were physical beings, but without spirits. Plants lacked the physical mobility of animals, but were still considered alive, if not sentient. And minerals were at the lowest level of the great chain of being. They have no life, but they are still considered useful to humanity. Now, in case you think that I'm exaggerating here, I want to quote to you from the Bible creation story, which is the foundation of the Judeo-Christian culture, which is dominant in the West. In that Bible, God is quoted as saying, Adam, the first man, quote, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living being that moves upon the earth." That's from Genesis, the first book of the Bible, and you can look it up if you'd like, if you're interested. The concept of the great chain of being and of humanity's dominance over nature persisted for a long time until the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution challenged the divine plan in the 18th and 19th centuries. However, this this mental schema, this cultural model still lingers on in Christian metaphysics, in the ideas that there are higher and lower beings in each one of these categories. And in the idea in Western Canada, in Western culture, the assumption that human dominance over the earth is a natural state of being. Now, the second foundation of Western culture is the capitalist system. And I think anyone who's ever taken a course in economics has probably seen some version of this diagram. It depicts how the flow of money occurs in a capitalist economy. And just briefly, I'll explain that the inner circle of money flow shows how resources feed businesses by providing the factors of production. Businesses create products, which are sold to households. Households provide the labor and the capital that help exploit the resources needed by businesses. And in the outer circle of money flows, households spend money on products, which in turn provides revenue for business. Businesses use these revenues to pay for the resources used in the development of their products. And from the exploitation of resources, households derive wages and returns on their investments. The key values in this particular cultural system are efficiency of the process and continual growth of the economy. The values implicit in this model have partially eclipsed those of the great chain of being. In the capitalist economy, relationships in the chain are reciprocal rather than hierarchical. But the idea that only these components play a role in the operation of the value chain has dominated Western culture for over 200 years and has become so embedded in the value system that it's rarely questioned. However, it's worth noting what is left out of this diagram, namely the environment, society, and the state. All of these systems support the components depicted in the diagram, but are considered exogenous and mostly irrelevant to the four key factors of production and consumption. Now, in the past 2 or 3 decades, as the threat of climate change has become more apparent, many thinkers in a variety of disciplines have proposed a reframing of the cultural foundations used to govern our relationships with the world around us. Now, many models have been proposed, and I only have time to show you one, which is the one that with which I'm most familiar. It's actually a very old cultural model. It's drawn from the worldview of the Anishinaabe group of indigenous peoples of North America. The diagram depicts the medicine wheel, a cultural symbol that can be used to convey a variety of meanings in a holistic and balanced way. In this slide, I've used it to show how it can be applied to the concept of sustainability. The 4 pillars of sustainability, environment, culture, society, and economy, comprise the 4 equal quadrants of the circle, joined by a sequence that proceeds in a clockwise direction, with the center representing the balanced nature of the universe. The wheel is therefore a symbol of wholeness and interconnectedness, and is used as a sacred geometry to illustrate the cycles of nature at both macro and micro levels, and to show how the various aspects of sustainability are linked in a holistic manner. The cultural values reflected in this worldview are based on principles of harmony and balance. A sacred responsibility is derived from this relationship, one which is in which the Aboriginal peoples who developed this model are considered caretakers of the earth, treating the plants, the animals, the minerals, the human beings, and all life on the earth as if they were part of themselves, with the responsibility to ensure survival for future generations. Well, assuming that a new cultural worldview, such as the one that I just described, becomes more common in Western culture, what kind of an economic model would best work within this framework? Now, many models have been proposed, and again, I'm only going to show you just one, a concept called donut economics, first described by the economist Kate Raworth. The word donut refers to the light green space in the diagram, which Raworth labels the safe and just space for humanity. You'll note that unlike the capitalist model shown earlier, the donut economy is situated within two spaces, the societal foundation in the middle and the ecological ceiling, which is outside the donut. The social foundation outlines the 12 basics of life to which all human beings are entitled, such things as sufficient food, clean water, access to healthcare and to education. It defines the social space of humanity's well-being. The ecological ceiling beyond the outer ring of the donut depicts the well-known effects of going beyond the carrying capacity of the earth, such as climate change, chemical pollution, and biodiversity loss. If the donut of the economy falls below the social foundation, human well-being will suffer. If it expands too far beyond the ecological ceiling, the earth will suffer. Given what I've just described, it would appear logical for our social, economic, and technical systems to pivot to a more holistic and less damaging cultural model. Yet, it's proving extraordinarily difficult to change behaviors. Why? The main reason I would suggest is that our cultural values have not really changed, despite the increasingly urgent messages being sent to us by climate experts, ecologists, scientists, and environmental activists. Now, why is that? Examine the two lists on this slide. On the left are some of the values we espouse in our current culture: bigger, faster, more. Now, ask yourself honestly, wouldn't you automatically select a bigger house or a faster means of transportation rather than a smaller house or a slower way of traveling if given the choice, with all of the ecological implications that this has? Our cultural values impel us to want more, to grow our possessions and to consume more. And even as we know that consuming less, recycling more, and leading a more balanced life would be better for our communities and for our planet. The hardest part of the transition to an alternative culture will be to start valuing regeneration more than extraction, and to recognize that humans are not the dominant species at the top of the chain of being, but one of many diverse species will have to coexist on the planet if we are to survive. Now, I know that I've painted a rather bleak picture of the cultural challenges of a societal transition to carbon neutral future, but fortunately my colleagues on the panel have some practical suggestions on how we might accomplish this. Therefore, I will now turn the microphone over to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That's really interesting. I'm so excited to see that donut economic circle there in the safe operating space. I think that's some excellent point where we can, definitely revisit in our panel discussion. So next, thanks, Sharon. And next, let's welcome Dr. Zhao from University of British Columbia to share her insights. Welcome, Jiaying.
Thank you, Shanshan, for the invitation. Good evening from Vancouver. My name is Zhao. I'm a professor of psychology and sustainability at the University of British Columbia, and I have only one slide to share. So to reach net zero, we need concerted efforts from policymakers and industry leaders to institute top-down structural changes, and also from individuals and communities to instigate bottom-up behavior changes to collectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to talk about two things. One is, how can we leverage psychological insights to change behaviors at the individual level, as well as at the societal level? So for a person to change their behaviors, there are two types of forces at play. There are driving forces that make someone change, and there are restraining forces that stop them from changing. So I'll first look at the cognitive biases restraining forces that stop people from taking actions. Then we'll go over a social diffusion model to scale up climate action from individuals to the collective. Okay, so my student and I have recently proposed a framework that outlines the predominant cognitive biases that give rise to climate skepticism and disbeliefs, such as attentional biases, perceptual biases. I think Zoe talked about those, the estimation errors that she talked about, status quo bias, single action bias. This framework also identifies the causes of these biases. So is it because of motivated cognition or cognitive rigidity, for instance? And finally, it proposes debiasing tools to mitigate these biases, such as framing, default, reinforcement of identities and values. So this framework helps to kind of reshape people's beliefs or disbeliefs on climate change by targeting these specific cognitive biases. So let me give you one example. We recently found that there's an attentional bias between liberals and conservatives. By that I mean conservative individuals in North America tend to look away from climate change evidence, whereas for liberal individuals, their attention is drawn toward climate change evidence. Now, this attentional bias can be driven by motivated cognition stemming from, conservative and liberal ideologies and beliefs. And this belief can further attenuate the pre-existing levels of concerns of climate change and, forming a positive feedback loop between concerns, actions, and motivated cognition. So a potential debiasing tool for this attentional bias is to use visualization. We can visualize climate change evidence by plotting the greenhouse gas emissions stemming from human activities as opposed to natural forces. So this can dissociate human versus natural causes of climate change and highlighting the need to reduce anthropogenic climate or carbon emissions. So I think when Zoe talked about these estimation errors, I think I'm already starting to talk about what is driving those errors. And Zoe, I would love to hear your thoughts on why and what we can do to remove these kind of perceptual biases. So beyond mitigating these cognitive biases within an individual, how can we scale up climate action across the population? So here's another framework that my students and I proposed that uses a kind of a social diffusion approach. This model offers a recipe for enabling a variety of climate actions, including private individual actions like driving less, flying less, eating less red meat, for instance. It also promotes social signaling actions like sharing information on social media, basically showing to other people what you're doing, as well as civic actions like voting, signing petitions, etc. So for a given climate action, this model segments a given population based on the adoption rate of the action into distinct groups of people. So these groups are change agents. So these are climate activists and NGOs or policymakers or innovators of climate technologies, to early adopters, to early majority, late majority, and laggards. So this is basically using the diffusion of innovation theory. That's very much like stemming from that theory. Within each segment, this framework identifies the driving forces and restraining forces of the action. So this is the force field analysis from Kurt Lewin. And finally, this framework proposes the appropriate interventions to increase the driving forces or to remove the restraining forces of a given group. So for change agents, they're driven by pro-climate, pro-environmental values and identities. They like to take risks, but they face resource constraints, right? But for early majority, or actually, I think that the same kind of forces are faced by early adopters as well. So for early majority, that's kind of the next kind of 40% of the population. They're driven by kind of, personal benefits and the desire to emulate the early adopters, but they're restrained by limited access to actionable options. They also experience cognitive biases like pseudo-inefficacy, basically the belief that every action, the things I do is not going to make a difference, or the single action bias, which is if I take one thing, if I make one change, that's sufficient. The lay majority, that constitutes the next kind of 40% of the population, they take action because of social pressure. They see that most people are already doing it, or the desire to fit in. They don't want to be left behind. So they're likely to suffer from confirmation bias, basically motivational biases that prevent them from acting. So present bias or status quo bias, that they're reluctant to change because the status quo feels nice. And interventions, I think, targeting those could involve like changing the default, so making climate-friendly options the default. And finally, the laggards are the most reluctant group to act, and they're most resistant to change. And they do so because of their strong convictions that that challenge the validity of climate change or climate actions, and they will only act if there's significant pressure from their peers, or there's coercion from laws or legislations and mandates, for instance. So these two frameworks, targeting actions at different levels, offer a blueprint for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to reach net zero by removing the cognitive biases within given individuals and the restraining forces of a certain group to mobilize climate action basically across different segments of the population. Okay, so that's my presentation. Back to you, Shanshan.
Thank you so much, Jiaying. This is also really interesting and at different ends of spectrums, and I really enjoy looking at those two really cool graphs. And I already see that you're trying to connect the dots with other panelists, which I'm really excited about. And next, let's welcome Professor Paulson. And after his presentation, we will jump directly to our very, I believe, excited panel discussion. Welcome, Paul.
Hello, and okay, just a second. Can you see my screen?
Please feel free to share your screen. Can you
Yes,
see?
I thought I was sharing my screen. Just a second. Screen. But now, right on my screen. Can you see it now? Not yet?
Not yet, but don't worry, try again.
I was able to do this before.
Yes.
Let's see, let's go over here. Oh, I can't do both at the same time. Screen, and I'm getting select. Wait a minute. There we go. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So my understanding of this whole conference has been, about getting to net zero, and I think that in the previous sessions you have heard a lot about technological change and policy initiatives. And this session so far, you have heard a lot about behavior at the individual level and some of the things that influence it, including cultural beliefs and misperceptions and so forth. My focus is going to be on initiatives, things that can promote change potentially, and what kinds of change they promote that would lead to consequences that move toward net zero. Next, here is an outline. In this particular panel, I think a lot of it is the focus has been on individual behavior, as I've said, and presuming a lot of it is about individuals changing themselves, in particular their consumer behavior, and within that, a lot of it is on sort of everyday behavior related to doing less. There's other kinds of behavior, and there's other kinds of roles than that of the consumer that are important. In addition, initiatives in the social system come from many actors beyond individuals, although individuals can affect the other actors. I will say something about adoption, implementation, and design of initiatives. I'll go into that in another slide, and about what responses depend on. I'll move on to the next. This is a diagram. It's kind of schematic. The circle on the left represents the network of influences in the society, and I could have more boxes in it, but the boxes are individuals, households, profit-seeking organizations, governmental organizations, and nonprofit organizations and social groups. These things can all influence each other. So they're little narrow arrows pointing from each box to each other box. And if you're thinking about behavior of individuals, they can influence not only themselves, but entities in these other boxes, vice versa. So individuals influencing government is about public support for policy. Social movements influencing government, and so on. Government influencing organizations with policies. Out of this network can come initiative, that is, efforts to change the behaviors, the choices, the investments that affect climate. And out of those initiatives, to the extent that they're successful, come a variety of outcomes, not only environmental, social, political, economic, and distributional of goods and benefits, and so on. To unpack the diagram a little bit, individuals as change agents can act in many different roles. You've heard a lot about the consumer role in this panel. Individuals can also act as investors. They can invest in their own homes, but they can invest if they have retirement plans, for example, or if they own stock. This is mostly people at higher socioeconomic status can act as investors and influence the entities that they invest in. They can act within organizations where they have influence. Their universities, their employers, their organizations. They can act as citizens, trying to influence policy, and as role models within social groups, neighborhoods, or other kinds of social groups. The effectiveness of individuals in these roles, as it says here, depends on the social and financial resources they can deploy in those roles, which generally correlates with socioeconomic status. But for an individual who wants to act as a change agent regarding getting to zero, it makes sense to think about all of these roles and where you can have the most influence on choices that have the greatest impact on climate change. To unpack a little bit further, lots of initiatives are proposed. Governments propose regulations, they propose carbon taxes, they offer information about climate change, they support development of new technologies, so do private enterprises do all those things. Lots of initiatives are proposed, fewer are adopted. This is a concept of initiative feasibility, which includes, of all of these possible initiatives, what's the likelihood that they will be adopted? Once they're adopted, what's the likelihood that they will be fully implemented, which in turn is influenced by the design of the initiative. I'll take an example. Governments have offered financial incentives to households to insulate their homes or to adopt photovoltaic energy systems. They offer money, they provide information. Even when it's profitable for the household to do it, they don't always do it. The initiatives can be designed in ways that are more effective, less effective. There's been a lot of research on that. I've participated in some of it. It has generated some design principles. Even if you have, we found back in the 1980s, programs that were offering very large financial incentives for home insulation retrofits. Same program and the same incentive implemented by different organizations had uptake that varied by a factor of 10, according to how the organization designed their program. So all of these initiative feasibility factors result in initiative as implemented. And that in turn influences behavioral response, what we call behavioral plasticity. This reference to Disney's law, if anybody's seen any Walt Disney productions, is the idea that wishing will make it so. Disney's law doesn't apply to initiatives. They're not always feasible. It doesn't always apply to behavior change. So we have seen in some of the presentations in this panel a lot of focus on characteristics of the responders, their beliefs, their cultural context. And those are very important. The attributes of the mitigation initiatives are also very important, as noticed, it's suggested by the concept of design. And then there are contextual factors. Coming from the United States, I know that if you want people to get their mobility by bicycles or public transportation, there are many, many millions of people for whom that's not feasible with the way cities and suburbs, rural areas are laid out. The options are not available or prohibitively slow or expensive. And so initiatives need to be designed to take into account the contextual factors affecting the intended responders. We'll go down. How far can any initiative move the system toward net zero? What determines the outcomes? And focus here on the climate or environmental outcomes. We have a rough equation. The achieved mitigation is the product of the technical potential. What would happen if it fully achieved its objectives? If the carbon tax got everybody to do what the economists say is economically rational. The initiative feasibility, the likelihood that a change agent will adopt and implement the initiative. Again, with a carbon tax in the United States, where I live, you can't get the political support for it. It'd be nice in theory, but you can't enact it. If you do enact it, the targets of the initiative, many of them will find a way to get around it, to evade the tax. And that's part of the feasibility. Behavioral plasticity is the extent to which an initiative, once implemented, yields the intended responses, and that's the design of the initiative has lots of. So roughly we think of achieved mitigation as the product of these three factors. Now I would add that these things, maybe the technical potential is a constant. The others are not constants. They can be influenced by what change agents do. And depending on who the target of the initiative is, if the target is, for example, a profit-making business, and you want to get them to lower the carbon footprints of their suppliers, there are ways to do that, ways that don't do that. Information probably doesn't do much, but there's more hope if you establish a carbon labeling system that allows them to identify the carbon footprints of their suppliers, put pressure on the suppliers, say, I want you to lower your carbon footprint or I won't buy from you. It's a complicated social system in which the individual consumer behavior is a part. Some analysts attribute carbon emissions from the whole product life cycle that leads up to the consumer choices. But in fact, there are choices all along the line. So I will stop here because I'm probably out of time, but I hope this will be some fodder for later discussion. Turn this back over.
Yes, thanks a lot, Paul. You can stop sharing the screen.
Yes, I can stop sharing. Come on.
No problem. Take your time. Yeah, I just would like to say thank you so much, Paul, for your this is very interesting presentation. We will soon start.
Okay, there's the stop share button. Stop share.
Here we go. We're back. We're all back. Yay. And now we'll go move on to what I'm sure will be a very interesting panel discussion. I will raise a few questions in the next hour or so, and I might direct the question to each of you based on your expertise, but you are more than welcome to either click the button of raise my hand and I will pass the microphone to you, or you just indeed raise your hand and we will keep the discussion going on. And my colleague, Dr. Feng Liao from CAM, she's very kindly helped us to collecting all audience questions, and hopefully we would also have some time to touch upon them. So I think Paul addressed show us a really interesting formula, which is, if I remember that correctly, achieve the mitigation. And we can see that components there, like one is technical potential, the other one is initiative feasibility. And I think both, from my understanding, I think both of those are more easy or less uncertain to carry on. But I really like the last component, which is called, I think, behavioral plasticity. And I like plasticity because that means, to me, that means a lot of uncertainty. So maybe we can start from there, and we can start from how individual can think very differently, and sometimes it's very difficult to change their behavior. So I think all of you have touched upon something around misperception and cognitive bias. So cognitive bias appears to be a key barrier in externalizing one individual's action towards more pro-environmental behavior, climate action. What do you feel are the key challenges in overcoming this cognitive bias? I think Zoe and Jiaying might already touch upon some in your presentation, but I think the audiences would like to hear, just unfold this a little more. And if maybe Zoe, you would like to share your insights on this?
Sure, it's a great question, Shanshan. And as a researcher, I think one of the big challenges of when it comes to tackling cognitive biases, and in my case, misperceptions, is how do you correct a misperception without a backfire effect occurring? So, like, one classic thing is people tend to underestimate the amount of scientific consensus on climate change. They think it's much lower than it actually is. In an ideal world, it would be as simple as saying, well, actually, the consensus among climate scientists is about 97%. So I think I talked about negative reference at the start of my talk. And unfortunately, for a lot of people in some countries, scientists have become to be perceived as negative reference. So if you tell someone, hey, this group of people that you don't trust at all think this way, you're unwittingly giving them a motivation to think in a completely different way, because scientists are the untrustworthy part of the elite. So if we think about, the other thing to think about is if you're giving them behavioural feedback, for instance, in a bid to make them do better. If you just tell them, oh, well, you need to lift your game because you're a bad person, what functions are you implicating there? How do you give them that? How do you give them that feedback in a way that doesn't threaten their self-esteem or demotivate them, and so on? So I think one of the ways to address those biases is not to concentrate on the individual themselves, because we can fall into that trap of blaming the individual as well. So it's a whole blame shifting thing that is a real problematic focus of individual behaviour. But to talk about misperceptions in terms of how they see other people. So rather than 97% of scientists agree, it could be the majority of people who share your particular ideology agree with these, initiatives, or people living in the same neighbourhood as you are doing all this great stuff. They support these, mitigation initiatives and so on. People who are your same background actually do care about that stuff. So that makes it about the attitudes and behaviours of people like them, rather than pointing a finger at the individual themselves, which might overcome some of the backlash effects of telling people, hey, you're somehow faulty, which is never a good message to hear. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear other thoughts on how to correct misperceptions without triggering backfire effects.
Wow, that's very enlightening comments. Thanks a lot, Zoe. That's really well taken points. Maybe Jiaying or Sharon or Paul, you would like to share some other comments?
Yeah, I think I would like to kind of highlight that we shouldn't put so much onus on the consumers themselves. Like teaching the public the right carbon, let's say the emissions or the footprint information, that's a huge task. I mean, I've asked, climate experts what your carbon footprint is. They have no idea. So I think, maybe instead of correcting their biases, why can't we just set up the infrastructure easy such that, it almost doesn't take additional effort for people to behave or to take actions. So let me give you an example. If we make electric vehicles prevalent, easy to charge, cheap, then obviously people will opt for EVs as opposed to gasoline-powered vehicles, right? But that's not the case at this point. So instead of educating people the benefits of EVs, that's a huge task. Making them more affordable, more available, more charging stations more available, et cetera, that's going to automatically increase the adoption of the EV. So I think there's a lot that governments and businesses can do to kind of scale up climate action and kind of shift the onus away from consumers. That would be my suggestion.
Oh, that's a really insightful comment. I think making a comfortable transition, that's something, we should all make efforts to. Sorry, Sharon, I think you were trying to provide some insights there and I interrupt you. Please go ahead.
Well, I don't know if it's insight. I'm not, this isn't my area of expertise. As I said, I do cultural policy. But one of the things that I have noticed about cognitive biases is that they seem to be becoming more entrenched as a result of social media bubbles. And that's a big factor, I think, in why some people are completely against changing their behavior. They perceive it as being imposed upon them and perhaps not something that's even, the climate change is not real. I mean, I can use the example of the COVID pandemic, where people have said that it's not really there, that the vaccines are not effective, and that all of the scientists are lying. We get a little bit of this, I think, in climate change too, and it's some of the same people. I know that some of the non-adopters that Zoe spoke about are probably in this particular social media bubble, and they may not even be paying attention to their physical neighbors. What they're paying attention to are the messages they're getting from their particular social media group. There are a lot of interesting cultural issues there, which I'm really intrigued about, because in Canada we have quite a debate going on now about whether we should regulate social media in some fashion. Now, that's another whole area of policy, but it is becoming problematic because some of the opinions that are being expressed are not only demonstrating a cognitive bias, but they're determined to ensure that other people will not adopt these particular measures to mitigate climate change. And I do agree with Zhang that there's a lot the government could be doing. I know we're talking about individuals mostly in this panel and how individual behavior can change, but if there aren't enough people who are willing to make that step to change, if they're just completely closed off, then it makes the whole problem of changing the culture to become more conducive to net zero, a huge problem.
Let me offer a provocative statement that the behaviors of individuals and households as consumers that have the greatest impact on climate change are mostly unrelated to attitudes and beliefs. They're dependent on the behavior, not on what you think about climate change. So we'll take an example. Well, now take the electric vehicle example. That has a high technical potential. It has, in the United States anyway, quite low feasibility. Some of the things that Jiaying is talking about are feasible at the policy level, some of them less so. And whether people adopt electric vehicles or not, I would say from a belief, I haven't seen evidence, is probably not strongly related to their attitudes about climate change. It probably has more to do with how far they have to travel, whether there are charging stations, how large their family is, what the needs of their family are, all of these sorts of things. And there are forces that make it more attractive to adopt an electric vehicle and other forces that make it less attractive. And you really need to analyze those if you're going to create an effective program to promote adoption of electric vehicles. Similarly, photovoltaic electricity production, which has a huge technical potential. United States, again, which I know best, the government initiatives have been mostly focused on households. They've been mostly focused on rooftop PV, which is only available to people who own rooftops, not apartment dwellers, for example, and is less useful for people who live in some climates than in other climates. There are also policies that provide incentives for electric utilities to invest, or for companies or other organizations to invest in PV. There are incentives that there are pricing systems. And in some places, if you have a photovoltaic system, you can run your meter backwards and feed power into the grid. Some places not. So the behavior, understanding which behavior is changeable depends on taking a deep dive into the behavior. The effect of beliefs about climate change will matter more for some behaviors. I think it'll matter a lot for political behaviors. Trying to influence government about climate change will depend strongly on your beliefs about climate change. The consumer behaviors that really matter, less so. People will turn off their lights, their television, and put things in the recycling bin. Those don't add up to as much. But with well-designed initiatives, you can get behavioral plasticity in things that do matter. And it's not only appealing to climate change. You can get climate change deniers to do green things if you approach them right. Now, don't say you're doing this for the sake of climate change. Doing it because it saves money or it raises the value of your home. Some other things, it's convenient for your family. I'm talking. Turn it over to others.
Thanks.
Shanshan, do we have questions from the participants outside of the panel?
I haven't received yet, but I will definitely let you know.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Sharon, for sharing your additional, definitely insights to that question. And I think it links really nice to another question. Well, now I think I've already got the answer, which is that I was going to ask, well, except from removing cognitive bias to foster our more proactive climate actions, what other factors could be take into account here? And I think both all of you have shared something like how to shape our maybe communication ways, how to have better technology, how to have better socioeconomic structures, and very importantly, the culture, the whole governance approach. So before I move into the next question, would any of you like to add some extra comments there on this topic, I would say?
I think we have some difficulty because it really does depend a lot on what you're trying to change, what behavior you're trying to change, and whose behavior you're trying to change. When I say who, I mean organizations and governments as well as individuals. And the analysis, this equation that I put forward is, it's multiplicative, which means you can start anywhere. And it makes a lot of sense to start with technical potential, or what behaviors, if you change them, would make a big difference in the global carbon footprint, or in the country's carbon footprint, or in your city's carbon footprint. And you can begin there, and then you'd say, well, what could we do to change those behaviors? What initiatives would be feasible? And if feasible, how much would the intended responders respond? So you can sort of begin anywhere, but if you begin with what you can get people to do, the things that they think of first don't matter as much. The things that they do frequently don't matter as much as some of the things that they do infrequently. If you purchase an electric vehicle, a lot of things follow from that. If you use it, a lot of things follow from that. So how do you get people to do it? So you start anywhere. Psychologists tend to start from individual consumer behavior, frequently repeated behavior, because it's easier to measure. If you install rooftop solar, you do it once. If some of these other things, you can measure the frequency.
Yeah, totally.
If you're a psychologist who's interested in attitudes and beliefs, if you want to measure them, you need to measure things that happen frequently, quantify.
Yeah, I guess I have to take a slight issue with that. Some of the things that are most important in sustainability aren't measured and aren't measurable. I've done a lot of work on community sustainability planning, particularly from the point of view of cultural sustainability, but also always linked to environmental, social, and economic. And while you can find indicators to measure economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and in some cases social sustainability, it's really difficult to measure cultural sustainability. That is often what's most linked to well-being, and the communities that I studied, over 600 community sustainability plans, and hardly any of them were able to measure what was really important to them in terms of, they were reduced to saying, well, how many people have attend cultural events? How many people have access to a library? These are important elements of a community, but it doesn't get to the issue of what people really value in that community. And I guess what I found most interesting when I studied it was that what people valued was not necessarily subject to measurement in the kind of quantitative way that we are interested in measuring progress. It's often a lot of the communities would instead tell stories about what they thought was important in that community, what they valued in that community. So I think I don't dispute anything that anybody has said about the need to have governments online and industries and scientists and everyone working together to address the issues that we need to address for carbon, to reduce, to decarbonize our societies. But if people are not convinced, if they don't have the stories that tell them why this is important, it's really difficult. One of the things that I've also been interested in looking at is how the cultural sector itself, the expressive side, the artists, the performers, the writers, are trying to tell a more compelling story about why we need to move toward carbon to net zero. And that's something I think that needs to be factored in here, but it's not a nice, neat number that can be plugged in to a model.
Let me clarify just a little bit. I was not advocating the position that you can't quantify it as important. There are a lot of important things you can't quantify. Yeah, but coming to this originally as a social psychologist, you want to quantify things. And a lot of the things that researchers from that position, that intellectual position, want to quantify are not very important for global carbon emissions. Now, what Sharon, what you're talking about is cultural change, and there are a lot of people working in this field who use the phrase cultural transformation and say that's what's needed to get to net zero. And that may be true, but cultural transformation tends to take generations or more. And though I'm not against the kinds of cultural transformations you're talking about, we've got to get moving faster than that. And while that might be happening, I hope that happens. But meanwhile, we have to look at the things that can make a difference in the shorter term and that can last.
Thanks for your feedback. I think this actually, your discussion and Sharon's sharing of the insights leads to another very interesting discussion point, which is about leadership. So as we discussed, culture sustainability is very hard to measure, but we also need to measure and how that influence our behavior. I think leadership perhaps is a leverage point where we can utilize that to drive behavioral change, to drive even culture transformation. And would any of you like to share some experiences or based on your survey field work, like how leadership could play the role in fostering behavior change and how that works or not works in fostering net zero transition or decarbonization transformation?
Yeah, I think leadership. Well,
no, go ahead.
Leadership is enormously important if the leaders know what to do and what's the right thing to do. What you typically see here is that local leaders call for actions and people follow those either faith leaders or political leaders. But oftentimes in Western countries, leaders don't agree and no action is ever done, and laws can't be made because of the disagreements between leaders. And this is something that I highly admire China. For instance, China can just do whatever it makes sense for the country, and they can just make it happen overnight. That's unthinkable here. So I think leadership matters, but the effectiveness of leaders and how leadership translates into actual change is what matters. Right. So I think that's something that I really think we need to do better.
Well, that's a really good point. Paul, you were trying to share some.
Oh, well, so many things to say, but about leadership, And leadership exists within communities. So individuals have leadership within communities, but if you look at the private sector, if you live in a country where the public sector leadership is full of conflict and can't get anything done. My colleagues Mike Vandenberg and Jonathan Gilligan have written a lot, including the book, on what they call private governance. That the private sector can take leadership when the public sector does not. And we've seen that in the electric vehicle field, where you have companies that operate fleets of fleets of vehicles. Okay, we're going to switch over to electric. And that can be a form of leadership. You have an Amazon or a United Parcel Service or something like that that operates thousands of vehicles. And they say, we're going electric. That gets attention. And others may follow. It also creates economies of scale for the producers of the vehicles, which brings down the price, which makes it more attractive to other fleet operators and finally to households. So you have to look at leadership in, which community does the leadership appear in? And they're in household communities, and households, communities of companies, communities of cities. So,
yeah. Well, I can tell a little story about leadership, if you don't mind a story. There's a community in northern Canada called Old Crow. It's in the Yukon, and it's way above the Arctic Circle. It's during the winter, it has 24 hours of darkness practically, but in the summer, it's almost 24 hours of sunlight. Due to the leadership of the chief of the whole area is governed by the Vuntut Gwich'in First Nation, and this community has had to ship in diesel fuel to run its generators to get electricity, and that is obviously very polluting, and it involves a lot of carbon emissions. The community decided, with the leadership of the chief, to convert to solar completely during the summer months. And what they did was they installed a series of solar panels, which resulted in the reduction of 190,000 liters per year of diesel fuel, and reduced the community's annual carbon emissions by 750 tons annually. And that's a fairly small community, mind you. But what I found interesting was how the chief justified it. He said, when we first had electricity in our community in about 1978, my grandfather, it is said, could run with the caribou. Now his grandson is flying around the world with a supercomputer in his pocket. As we have progressed through the values of our economies and our societies, we have mistakenly left the bosom and the cradle of species, which is the land and the animals. But at a time when our decisions are more important than ever, I look to the many solutions that are there. I know that for our community, it's important to be able to take advantage of these technologies that are embodying our Indigenous values of living in balance with our land in perpetuity. And they deliberately chose solar because of that set of values in that community. But it wouldn't have happened if the leader in that community had not decided that they wanted to move off diesel and get onto solar power. And there were a couple of side benefits to that as well. Solar generators, diesel generators make a huge amount of noise, and they have to run continuously 24 hours a day. And when they were able to shut them off for 6 months because they had like close to 24 hours of sunshine, they said they discovered, like, it was so silent. They said they could hear the birds, they could hear the wind again. It was like, here we are again, the things that can't be measured, but that were important to them. and simply by switching from diesel to solar, they were able to recapture a lot of what they considered important qualities of living in their community. So that's my story about sustainability and decarbonization in one community. It depended on a lot of things. It depended on support from the federal government too, because obviously it cost a lot of money to ship the solar panels up there and install them. But they managed to do it with the leadership that in place. So I think it is possible. I do agree that leadership is important.
Oh, thanks, Sharon, for sharing this very encouraging and inspiring story. And it's great to know that it's happening. And also, as you explained to us, it creates a lot of co-benefits. So yeah, exactly. Leadership, it depends on how effectiveness we can install the leadership, but it seems like there's a way to definitely do that. And maybe, I'm not going to say it's a magic pill, but the collaboration, cooperation, and engagement from the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach, that's really important. While you were talking, I just saw Zoe kind of unmute herself. So maybe Zoe, you would like to share some leadership experiences or...
I had a story of leadership too, and then Sharon started telling her story, and I thought, oh, I can't compete with that. That's so romantic and beautiful. This is kind of a bit of a grittier version, but it's not your classic example of leadership, but it's where kind of governments and industries can take a lead as well. So this is back. So the Water Corporation of Western Australia. We're looking to introduce something called managed aquifer recharge in Perth. So Perth is a really, really dry place, and it's getting drier. It has all these water security problems. So managed aquifer recharge, technically this is a great solution. So you take sewage, you treat the sewage, you inject the sewage into aquifers, and then you redraw that, which has now been kind of double treated, for drinking water purposes. So the Water Corporation and Department of Health and a few other related bodies came to the CSIRO and came to the Social Science Department and said, I don't think this is going to fly because we've done some initial polling and the community's hesitant about it, right? Because they're like, and they're like, it's the yuck factor. They think there's going to be gender benders in the water. So we want you to go and ask the community what are the chemicals in the water that we now have to go away and overtreat and spend $1 gazillion getting rid of it. Even though we know that treatment standards fine, and we're like, well, that's an assumption. You're making an assumption of what community hesitancy is about. Would you be willing to participate in our research yourself? And they're like, oh, yeah, sure, which was quite a leap of faith for them. It's like, a group of psychology people saying, we want to study you as well as the community. So we use something called Q methodology, which itemizes a list of issues that people might have with something. So in this case, managed aquifer recharge. And we got people to list on a board, these are these key issues. This is what I'm this is what I'm worried about. This is what I don't care about. And all of these issues are somewhere in the middle. So we got a group of community people to do that. And we also got our industry and government partners to do that as well. And because I find it just fascinating, we said, hey, government and industry partners, can you do that same Q sort, but pretend you're a typical member of the Perth community? And they were like, oh, totally, this is going to be easy. It's going to be totally easy. We know what the community is about. And then we showed them the 3 sets of Q sorts. And it's like the concerns of the government, government and industry almost mirrored the concerns of the community. And it wasn't about, gender benders in the water or, becoming sick because of some contaminant. It was that the governance arrangements for their proposal were so convoluted that there was system risk. And the governance people knew it and the community knew it. And they were like, sort that stuff out first, make it clear who's in charge of what, and then you'll allay my concerns. We don't care about the chemicals and da da da. And so I think it was a strong kind of, again, a kind of a leap of faith to trust the social science here for Water Corporation to go away and say, okay, don't worry about the biochemical component of this. We've got to tighten up the governance arrangements. They did that. They communicated clearly with the public and they implemented it. So it's happening now. It's been happening for years now without fuss. So I think that was kind of a great example of how, science can act as a kind of a bridge between the community and, government and industry leaders too.
Wow.
It's not very romantic because it's about sewage.
No problem. No, that's really, really a nice example. Sorry, Sharon, you were trying to say something.
Oh, I was just laughing.
Okay. Yeah, that's another excellent example. And Zoe, thank you so much for walking us towards the thing that I would like to raise for the next question. So you mentioned science communication. I think I can't remember exactly, but maybe Sharon or maybe Paul or maybe Jiaying mentioned something similar in their presentation. So we all know that we're moving towards a digitalization world, which makes the communication a lot easier. And like what we're doing here today, we're using the digital tools to communicate with the broader audience. We suffer thoughts, we suffer opinions regarding net zero transition from the behavior aspects. So given that we're also moving towards our closing time, which I really wish we could have more time to continue this story sharing, continue our sparkling of different thoughts from different aspects. I would like to hear from each of you, what do you feel we could leverage this new digitalization network and make more effective communication with the broader communities, not just us, but like Zoe showed us, with the government, with the community, with other stakeholders? And what do you feel would be the most important research frontier and research priorities that we should communicate with the broader communities?
Pick up on some of this, following what Zoe said, which or at least my interpretation of what you said, Zoe, is that if you have a system where the various, I like to call them interested and affected parties, some people call them stakeholders, can communicate with each other, engage with each other in a process in which a somewhat respectful process, and come out with something with initiatives, but also with procedures. Because one of the key issues the digital world raises is trust. There's all kinds of information out there. What's worth believing? So you need to have a system, and in the wastewater management system that Zoe is talking about, I think that if the policy that's made includes a way for the various interested and affected parties to check in a trustworthy way on whether their needs are being met, whether their risks are being reduced, and so forth. You need to set up a governance system that is designed to promote trust, and it becomes much more of an issue in the digital world because information comes from all over the place. Some of it is deliberate disinformation. And how do you know? It can be a lot worse in the present situation. And, we see that if you look at world politics. And, what the Russians and the Ukrainians are producing and putting out online, what's being attributed to whom, you don't know what the real source is. And, how do you evaluate? As an individual, it's very hard. Who do you trust? You go to the news sources that you trust and you believe them. But there are other news sources that are saying the opposite. So, there really is an institutional design issue that is very important nowadays with instantaneous communication.
Very true. Yeah, that's really insightful comments, and I think that's quite important points also to take away from me, at least. It's very important to make things right from the beginning, and also make the communication and governance working together, not going to separate ways. Anyone else would like to comment?
Yeah, I would like to touch on the equity aspect of digitalization. I think using digital media, digital platforms makes things more equitable. It increases access and amplifies voices from vulnerable, underrepresented, marginalized communities, right? I mean, now we're having a conference from people from 4 different time zones. Before COVID, that's going to take a lot of time and effort to travel to Beijing to attend this conference. Now, with Zoom conference or online conferences, people from all around the world can attend. It removes barriers for being included in these events. It allows people to raise their voice, to make themselves heard at the international stage. Now, I think it's there are tremendous benefits of digitalization right now. But again, I think there are dangers like misinformation, organized online campaigns, for instance, against climate change. These are kind of the dangers.
Thanks, Jiaying. That's really also very nice message and very important message. Thanks a lot. Sharon?
You raised a really complex issue on this digital one. It's not an easy one to address because of all of on one hand, it is more equitable. On the other hand, it can lead to all sorts of echo chambers from which nobody ever escapes. I've always thought that there's merit in combining digital and interpersonal communication, especially in terms of developing trust. If you know people and if you feel that you can trust them, you're often more open to a message. And this is, in a digital world, you can't be sure who you're with. So sometimes you go down the rabbit hole. But on the whole, I think that it's probably more useful to have as many voices out there as possible discussing these issues rather than trying to limit the discussion to a certain group that is considered, the experts and those who are not, because a lot of them are interesting initiatives that come up from the bottom, I find. And, it takes a while for them to bubble up, filter up to the levels where decisions can be taken. But it's worthwhile, I think, to use digital tools to try and increase the effectiveness of that messaging going up to decision makers. It's just that sometimes you have unwanted side effects, as Jiaying pointed out.
Totally. That's very, very insightful comments. Zoe, please. The floor is yours.
Just following on from Sharon's comment about the bottom-up initiatives and the digital space. I'm not sure if other people are familiar with the Buy Nothing initiative, which I believe started in North America, perhaps Canada, perhaps the United States, filtered down to Australia. It is incredibly popular here, and probably the only positive thing about Facebook, apart from keeping in touch with your relatives. And so it's this bit where you're only allowed to join one group, and it's your local suburb or cluster of suburbs. And it's on the front of it, it's, okay, before you throw this thing out, why not see if your neighbour would find a potential use for it? And obviously people say, don't chuck that out, I'll have that. And so you've got this amazing benefit that, it reduces consumption because you don't have to go out and have to buy stuff and you get something for free. But it really is, if you look at why it was established, that's kind of a great environmental byproduct of it. And really, first and foremost, it's about creating community connectedness in a world where, we're more and more fragmented and we don't know our neighbours and so on and so forth. And so I've been part of several Buy Nothing groups, and I can tell you that the amount of people that you get to know, even if it's just like an avatar, but when COVID hit and we all got plunged into lockdown, those Buy Nothing groups were just amazing in terms of, has anyone checked on Irene? She's, on this street, number 85, someone do a door knock. And, if she wasn't part of that Buy Nothing group, no one would have known Irene. But things like that are wonderful kind of initiatives that, even like gardening groups and local grow your own vegetable groups that serve to kind of create little communities of practice, but also kind of, yes, it potentially creates its own echo chamber, whereby you think, everybody is interested in gardening too. But it's, an echo chamber for goods, and it kind of reinforces the fact that you're not the only person that's, thinking about these as important issues.
Oh, thanks, Zoe, and thanks for sharing this very interesting working example. So, as I said, I wish we could have more time to continue this conversation. I just feel like myself very big into that and want to learn more. But unfortunately, time is just running out very fast without our attention to that. But at the very end, I would just like to thank you all for attending this amazing and the last panel of our conference. Well, I feel quite inspired after this very aspirational panel discussion. And of course, I myself have a long list of what I can make a difference from my everyday life in good ways, starting from today, perhaps. And as we all know that in nearly all model settings and scenarios about net zero, there are always uncertainties attached. But it seems like they are largely dependent on how we, human beings, will behave. Well, there are a lot of different various factors to take in as we discussed today, like cognitives, like perception, like behavior changes. But I believe we should have the faith and capacity to turn challenges into opportunities. And actually, at this point, while we are discussing a lot of different things, I just cannot stop thinking one of my favorite songs from the Cranberries debut album, which is called Everybody Else Is Doing It, So Why Can't We? And I just want to reflect that to make the closing remark, if I may do that. All my life is changing every day in every possible way. So I very much hope that you all take away a full bag of useful brain food from this panel and the whole conference. And well, now I will say farewell to my lovely panelists. Please, our audiences, stay tuned and enjoy the very high-level closing plenary talk from Dr. Louise Collins, the editor-in-chief at Wonders, just in a few minutes. See you all, and please take care. And goodbye for now. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.